Lori Dan was a 30-year-old woman who faced severe mental issues her entire life. Lori was raised in Highland Park and was an only child. She had come from a privileged and upper-class family. Her family came from one of the wealthiest suburbs in the United States. Her family provided many academic opportunities through education and schooling, therefore was set to have a successful future. Throughout Dan's life, she had been on and off with medications prescribed to her by her doctors. These medications were treating her various disorders.
The turning point of Lori Dan's life was May 20th, 1988. On this date, Lori Dan entered a second grade classroom at Hubbard Elementary School. She told the administration of that elementary school that she was giving a presentation about gun safety. She then proceeded to open fire on the second grade classroom. She killed one 9-year-old boy and injured 5 more children. Given this information, the Hubbard Woods Elementary School shooting shows that communities have a responsibility to maintain the mental health of those around them.
This Hubbard Woods Elementary School shooting is a representation of how an oblivious community failed to recognize the broken girl terrorizing their town until it was too late. Lori's actions on that fatal day demonstrate what can happen when a mentally ill patient goes without treatment. Due to the fact Dan was so broken, the night of the 20th, following the school shooting, Dan committed suicide.
Dan grew up a bizarre person. According to the Murder of Innocence podcast, she would ride elevators for hours at a time. She would steal frozen food from the people she was babysitting. These were only 2 of the many odd behaviors Lori presented. It was obvious that Dan's behaviors were abnormal and unusual. As time went on, Dan's mental condition began to deteriorate as she became more of a danger to both herself and the people around her.
According to VC Reporter, Lori Dan was severely mentally ill, and a lot of people knew it. It took a village of professionals choosing to ignore her propensity toward violence and flat-out bizarre behavior to create the environment for the bloodbath on May 20th, 1988. Many knew about the danger she caused to herself and to others. Dan's case showed the underlying faults in this community which failed to recognize her as the danger. The community chose to keep quiet instead of calling Dan out, jeopardizing her getting the help she needed and the support.
Growing up, Lori Dan's parents, Norman and Edith Wasserman, came from wealth and worked hard to upkeep their family image and reputation. Lori Dan's parents went to extreme lengths to make her more attractive and presentable by forcing Dan to get a nose job and her ears pinned back. Mr. and Mrs. Wasserman were aware of their daughter's mental condition from a young age. Psychiatrists, when she was up in Madison, wanted to institutionalize her. The psychiatrist thought she was becoming a danger to herself and others because of all of her troubling behaviors.
The psychiatrist called her father and he asked, "Are there behaviors that would make you think that Lori is dangerous to herself or to others?" And he said no, spoken from the Murder of Innocence podcast from Legal Talk Network. Mr. Wasserman chose to ignore the signs his troubled daughter was facing. He also prevented Dan the chance to heal and recover. Dan was not in a healthy mental state to make rational decisions for herself, leaving it up to her parents to have the final say with admitting her to a mental institution. Her parents failed her by denying her the right to get better, in spite of keeping their perfect family image.
Not only were Dan's parents aware, her former husband, Russell Dan, was also cognizant of her challenges. Russell Dan was stabbed with an ice pick as he slept one night in 1986. Lori Dan had stabbed her husband 2 years prior to the Hubbard Elementary School shooting. Russell knew she had been a danger, yet he decided to not report the situation but leave it instead. This was one of the many signs of Lori's ill behavior that was left untreated. The opening line of the New York Times article on Lori Dan states the Federal Bureau of Investigations knew what Lori Wasserman Dan did. So did the prosecutors in 3 states, so did her neighbor, her former husband, and in-laws. The community knew Lori was a threat to safety of the people prior to the shooting in May.
Dan was sick and struggling mentally in her day-to-day life. She left her well-being up to the community, which later failed her. Her actions on May 30th represent failure in the community, risking and changing lives. Situations dealing with psychopathic behaviors are built for the police and law enforcement. An example of the law letting her down was that Dan was legally able to purchase a gun with the known mental conditions she faced. Law enforcement failed to do their job to intervene and admit Lori to a mental institution. In the mental institution, Lori could have received treatment and help to recover from her condition. Lori Dan put lives in danger. The community viewed her attacks as regular occurrences and neglected to get her help. Communities need to recognize their responsibility in maintaining the safety of those around them.
Since the Hubbard Woods Elementary School shooting, laws have been put into place to better protect the citizens. A law known as the Firearm Conceal and Carry Act states, clinical psychologists and qualified examiners are to include any person that is adjudicated court-ordered mentally disabled person. The state government failed her due to the fact that a mentally ill individual was legally able to purchase a gun. By requiring psychologist evaluations for those adjudicated as mentally disabled, the law would provide extra precaution against individuals who might pose a risk to themselves or others due to mental health conditions. The Firearm Conceal and Carry Act was passed after Dan committed her crimes. However, if this act was in place or enforced earlier, Dan's actions could have been prevented. After the Hubbard Woods Elementary School shooting, for the first time, in 2021, the parents of a school shooter, Ethan Crumbley, were sentenced to 10 years in prison for their negligence towards their son's behavior. Ethan had spent many hours at shooting ranges and around guns with his parents Jennifer and James, following the purchase of their new firearm. Ethan had become extremely comfortable handling firearms and also taught his mother how to use one. Mrs. Crumbley saw no threat in her son being this comfortable with a gun, leading to no precautions when Ethan left the house with one. The Crumbleys were accused of not securing the newly purchased gun at home and acting indifferent to the signs of their son's deteriorating mental health. Following the shooting, the Crumbleys fled their home and hid from law enforcement. Later in court, Ethan was sentenced to life without parole, and Mr. and Mrs. Crumbley were charged with involuntary manslaughter. The Crumbleys being held responsible for their son's crime shows the evolution of law. Communities and family members are now able to be held responsible for the part they played in violence committed. Given this information, Dan's shooting is an example of a case where people of the community could have faced punishment. If Dan's case happened today, it is likely that the people in her life would be held responsible for their negligence with the role they played in Dan's life. With the progression society has had since Dan's case, mental health is brought to our attention, is overall more talked about, and seen less as a burden. The law and society has learned to better hold people accountable for the part they play in violent crimes. As society continues to evolve, it is crucial to educate people about mental health and raise awareness about how negligence could cost lives. By doing so, we can help prevent tragedies like the Hubbard Woods Elementary School shooting from happening in the future.